Chapter 5. In the Name of Justice. Presidential candidate Adlai Stevenson said that communism is the corruption of a dream of justice. Like so many things, his statement contains a hint of reality. Just substitute government for communism. The statement applies not only to communism, but to all political governments. Then substitute hope for corruption. Corruption implies that by applying the proper adjustments, justice is achievable. It is not. At least not in the external sense intended by this statement. As amended, the remark would read, government is the hope of a dream of justice. Of course, this is not at all what Mr. Stevenson intended to say. So why even start with his quote and then proceed to butcher it? Because of its hint of reality. A dream of justice. Precisely. External mechanisms for delivering justice are just that, dreams. They cannot be. Shouldn't human beings have dreams and goals? Sure they should. They are essential. But those dreams and goals should also be realistic. Leonardo da Vinci dreamed of a flying machine. For him to hold this dream was entirely realistic. His reason could conceive of the means whereby such an event would be possible. He was aware that it was not a goal that he could achieve, but it nevertheless was a realistic dream. Justice, on the other hand, can be contemplated by both searchers after authority and by searchers after what is. Both are human beings. Both are incomplete, imperfect, and limited. The searcher after authority pursues the dream of justice by attempting to devise a system where justice is sought external to the individual. An outside authority will mete out justice. The Consciologist recognizes that human laws attempt to oversimplify a reality by substituting certainty for possibility. The Consciologist acknowledges the limitations of the human condition, that human beings cannot achieve certainty, but must content themselves with possibilities. The searcher after authority ascribes the authority with the ability to achieve certainty. This is the dream of justice that cannot be. If justice is an unrealistic dream for the searcher after authority, would it not also be an unrealistic dream to the searcher after what is, who is likewise a human being with the same imperfections, incompleteness, and limitations? No, because the searcher after what is involved in an inward directed search rather than the outward directed search of the searcher after authority. The individual who is free to choose among all of the possibilities will choose from an ever decreasing selection of possibilities and will progressively approach ever closer to certainty. The human being whose choices are restricted by the outside authority will be forbidden by human law from exploring those possibilities. One must defer to the authority to determine after the fact what was certainty in each particular instance. This is comparable to keeping track of what a dog is learning by killing it and examining the brain under a microscope to determine just exactly what had changed. The problem is that subsequent attempts to add to what had been taught find the subject dead and no longer capable of learning. As with the stop sign examples in Chapter 2, learning takes place on rare occasions under particular crisis situations. These allow the individual the opportunity to draw one's understanding of the particular possibilities in a particular situation to reach a new conclusion based upon current, unique conditions. To the extent that human laws thwart the freedom of the individual to choose between legitimate possibilities, the human laws hinder humanity's evolution. Ultimately, as one seeks to expand one's awareness of consciousness, the process involves oneself and one's conscience, no one else, no outside authority. Oneself represents one's present awareness of consciousness. One's conscience represents one's potential to expand one's awareness of consciousness. H.L. Mencken said that conscience is the inner voice that warns that someone may be looking. Those religiously inclined define the someone who may be looking as God. Those governmentally inclined define the someone who may be looking as the policeman. Those with a social conscience define the someone who may be looking as any other individual, not oneself. But in this equation, neither God, nor policemen, nor other individuals are involved. The sovereign participant is oneself. Consciology conceives of consciousness as all-inclusive. There is no outside. One's awareness of consciousness represents one's position on the ladder of the evolution of the human species. One's conscience is the emotional part of one's mentality that gives one a feeling for the choices that will further one's awareness of consciousness. Choices that coincide with what is not only increase one's awareness of consciousness, but simultaneously upgrade the human species' position on the ladder of evolution by the amount of conscious energy possessed by this one individual. You will remember that conscious energy is to Consciology what others label spirit. This conscious energy is the guiding force of the universe. This is the power that does not make individuals do what they do not freely choose to do. This is the force that assists those who strive to achieve an increased awareness of what is. This force is decreasing resistance instead of increasing it. This force is empowering the individual rather than diminishing the individual to glorify the group. This is a force and power that emanates from the individual and that evolves the human species to an expanding awareness of consciousness. May the force be with you. Or more correctly, may you be with the force. This is the passion that inspires the searcher after what is. The degree of passion possessed by the searcher after authority has been discussed earlier in regard to addictions and the cruelty of imprisonment. But imprisonment is only a small part of the harm done in the name of justice. If one is angry, vindictive, revengeful, implacable, These dark emotions are treated as virtues in the name of justice. No matter how devious and petty one's crusade might be, it becomes glorious and even inspirational when cloaked in the guise of justice. The Bible merely indulges this hate rhetoric when it recounts God saying, "Vengeance is mine, I shall repay." To attempt to relieve the individual of the burden of vengeance is laudable, but to imply that something could get the best of God to the extent that God would need to get revenge is preposterous. Vengeance is the result of a misreading of the conditions under which the human species is evolving. Human beings are limited, incomplete, and imperfect. The search after what is involves an inward search for an expanding awareness of consciousness. The motion picture exchange is correct when Jack Nicholson responds to a plea for the truth with, "You can't handle the truth." Not only can we as individuals not handle the truth, we cannot know the truth. The truth is a concept of perfection, a condition quite foreign to incomplete, limited, and imperfect human beings still evolving. Human beings are perfecting, even perfectible, but certainly not perfect. The presumption is that somehow the attainment of perfection carries with it the reward of reaping vengeance. On the contrary, to one possessing the truth, vengeance could be nothing more than useless baggage full of outgrown concepts. Nevertheless, it is important to examine vengeance and the appeal it has to the masses, because it is the motivating force behind so many of the world's events. The typical plot for the Western category of motion pictures is vengeance. Someone killed my pa, and I'm going to spend my life to avenge his death. I'm going to get even with the guy who did in my kid brother. Or, to get a more adult rating, I must get even with the cowhand who mistreated my special girl when I was out on the range. In one way or another, the plot involves the perceived noble pursuit to right a wrong. Hate is elevated to nobility, and two wrongs are presented as equaling one right. Terrorism is presented as being justified to right some terrible wrong. Vengeance is the excuse for dragging an otherwise high-minded audience through all manner of viciousness and terrorism that these individuals would not otherwise subject themselves to, except for this mistaken notion that vengeance is somehow a noble pursuit. The murder mystery gains its audience with the same device. One is fascinated to learn the surly details of how one individual is so consumed by vengeance that it culminates in murder. The primary ingredient of the plot is almost always, vengeance of one kind or another. The Lucifer spirits are so prideful that they can never walk away from a good chance to get even. Something is terribly wrong here. Why does getting even with the one who is wrong have such a strong attraction as to cause one to join in the wrongdoing. If one's foundation in the right so tenuous that any negative impacts one's pride with such a devastating blow that one immediately forsakes the right and seems to delight in joining the miscreants? Oftentimes, an integral part of these plots involves making a point of the vulnerability of the individual, and that salvation comes with joining the group. Whether a governmental group, a religious group, or just a gang, the group assumes the burden of vengeance. Does one begin to realize the high price one pays for relief from this burden of vengeance? Just examine the term, getting even. It offers no hint of reward, and only rarely includes the possibility of recovering what has been lost. Does it look like pride is involved here? If one were to sit down and try to conceive of a circumstance where another human being could be inspired to risk life, love, and possessions with no thought of reward, one could expect to receive a lecture about how humans act only in anticipation of rewards. Well, that might be what brings one to Las Vegas initially. But what brings one back again and again is most likely a drive to get even. It is a matter of pride and the passion to get even. Vengeance is many times more powerful than the natural impulse to better oneself. Yes, this is still a desire to better oneself, from a negative position to the hope of recovery to a neutral position. The moral presented by the Western or the murder mystery is that vengeance is attainable. If vengeance is attainable by the individual, is not attainable by the individual, then the assistance of the group is required. The real ethical imperative is that vengeance is not attainable, period. But more helpful is the answer to the question, is vengeance desirable? When the 3rd Earl of Southampton most probably was writing under the pseudonym of William Shakespeare, he stated that all the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players. Human beings do not know the truth because they are limited, imperfect, and incomplete. But it can be deduced that were one in such a position, one would see how the players' parts on the world stage coalesce and intertwine for the perceived benefit of each individual from that individual's unique perspective. It likewise would probably become apparent that it is not the intention of any individual to act as an impediment to the progress of anyone else. Only when one misrepresents the actions of others as leaving one with no other alternative except to transgress his brother do negative actions occur. That starts the eternal landslide of vengeance that seems to gain in momentum until there can be no possibility of ever stopping it. The 10 Commandments contain no commandment to forsake vengeance. Perhaps if that one commandment existed, there would be no need for the 10 that do exist. Jesus said as much when he said, "A new commandment I give unto you, that ye love one another." It's a good commandment, or should we say, it's a good invitation. But it has proven much too broad for most individuals to apply in everyday living. It probably follows that if you love one another, you won't seek to shower vengeance upon them. But it needs to be spelled out. Without vengeance, violence would not exist. Vengeance is not a virtue. It is always an error in judgment. It is not justified, neither now or in the future. It is extremely difficult for most human beings to accept all of the ramifications of this statement. Love one another is so vague and broad that it is easy to accept verbally and immediately transgress in the details of one's life without ever really identifying the betrayal. Let's inspect some of the positive consequences that flow from the acceptance of the vengeance-free philosophy. Most importantly, we are relieved of the responsibility of creating justice on this earth. A crucial boundary is positioned between oneself and others. This is not a boundary that isolates one. It merely establishes one's authority over whether or not this boundary is crossed, and by whom, and with what frequency. The individual is the sovereign of this boundary, and may grant contracts of ingress and egress with whomever one mutually agrees to contract such a privilege. Identifying the trespasser without seeking vengeance will to many appear to be a sterile victory. But Consciology holds that when one sifts evil through the veil of reason, passion is filtered out and nothing remains but error. If one accepts that reason is the tool that separates the human from the animal, applying reason to what appears to be evil can identify what is animal passion, leaving nothing but an individual who has made an error in judgment. Vengeance attacks the animal passion involved in the transgression. But the party being judged is human, not animal. All appearances to the contrary, the animal passion is a futile attempt to return to an instinctual existence. The human being must overcome errors of reason if one is to expand one's awareness of consciousness. A human being may surrender oneself to vestigial animal instincts, but regardless, one continues to be a human being. With the revelation of self-consciousness, the gates to the Garden of Eden are closed forever. From that point on, reason is one's compass, and instinctual guidance ceases. To attempt to punish a human being that is acting as though by animal instinct is simply to become a codependent in that addiction. This reinforces the addictive behavior. If one desires that the transgressor progress past the addictive behavior, vengeance is not an option. Vengeance only reinforces the error. It is the substitution of a superior alternative that can conquer the addictive behavior. That superior alternative is one that presents a reasonable solution that will correct the demonstrated error in judgment. Reason may sound like a sterile solution, lacking in the passion necessary to overcome addictions so frantically championed. Not so. As Victor Hugo observed, no army can withstand the strength of an idea whose time has come. It is important to understand this concept of strength. The army avenges opposition by destroying it. But the strength of an idea whose time has come simply sweeps over everything like a summer breeze, penetrating and overcoming all opposition by its undeniably obvious validity, recognized by opposition and advocate alike. Vengeance has nothing to do with justice. Justice involves education. It is reason that conquers the addictive behavior. Of course, as long as one is mesmerized by the addictive behavior, one is not inspired to seek a reasonable solution. Only after the addiction has run its destructive course will its victim be open to considering reason. Vengeance delays that day of reckoning and multiplies the destruction that the addictive behavior assesses upon that individual and those with which that individual comes in contact. Just as the true meaning of power and force are more passive than overtly active, so justice is not a ruling from on high, but is an individual realization of what is. Power is not making someone do what one would otherwise choose not to do. Power results from voluntarily aligning oneself with what is. Force is not making someone do what one would otherwise choose not to do. Force results from voluntarily aligning oneself with what is. Justice is not making someone do what one would otherwise choose not to do. Justice results from voluntarily aligning oneself with what is. Here again, the difference is the searcher after authority, searching for outward solutions, and the searcher after what is, searching for internal solutions. Even if one were convinced of the impropriety of employing vengeance as a means to promoting justice, what about the danger one would face from those running amok from addictive behaviors who go unpunished and unrestrained? The government has convinced us that it protects us from these out-of-control elements in society by isolating them in jails after they have demonstrated their out-of-control behavior. There are at least two problems with this approach. First, this is not protection if it acts after the damage has been done. This only proves that those who have become victims of this out-of-control behavior had no protection, else they would not now be victims. Second, the government focuses its attention on future out-of-control behaviors. claiming that both the out-of-control individual in jail and those not in jail who are tempted to give in to out-of-control behavior are prevented from falling prey to these behaviors by this threat of incarceration. This demonstrates a basic misunderstanding of addictive behavior. What makes it addictive is that the individual, in one's present state of understanding, is ill-equipped to prevent the out-of-control behavior. Threats of incarceration are as naught when confronted by the power of the addiction over this addicted individual. The threat of jail has no bearing on the addict, powerless against one's addiction. The fact of jail, to those so confined, has a heavy bearing indeed. And that bearing is negative and destructive to this inmate and to the society into which this inmate will eventually be returned. The jailed individual, who is oneself the victim of one's own addiction, will feel that this incarceration is unjust. Unfortunately, this jailed individual's concept of justice is the same as the concept of justice that resulted in this individual's present incarceration. The vengeance that victimizes the jailed individual begets vengeance that this individual will seek to avenge after one's release from jail and return to society. The result of incarceration is to increase rather than decrease the total amount of vengeance present in society. In addition to the jailed individuals who have acted out their out-of-control addictive behaviors, there are others who are guilty of the same behavior, who either are not caught or who are caught and for one reason or another are not sentenced to jail. In the future, other individuals who now give no clue as to having any tendency to adopt these addictive behaviors will fall prey to these same addictive behaviors and will join these other groups of the jailed, the guilty but undiscovered, and the guilty but unincarcerated. All of these groups are harmed by the social vengeance of jail because they must live under the judgment of society that judges their addiction as rendering them inferior to the rest of society. Their sin is that they have failed to adequately deal with their addiction in such a way as to understand and finally subdue their addiction. This failure is a failure of this individual and one whose consequences this individual suffers. This is a fact, whether or not the wrath of society is added to this burden. There are those who will object that many of these individuals do not suffer at all. They appear to have no conscience and appear to possess no human emotion whatever. This might be the appearance, and this might even be close to fact. But the Consciologist is concerned with what is. The fact that certain human beings ignore what is does not attach any significance to their ignorance. Remember that human beings do not experience total freedom. The freedom that human beings experience is freedom to choose between available choices. Many choices. Included in those choices is a choice to choose to act in tandem with what is. Our actions in tandem with what is do nothing to enhance what is, but our actions in tandem with what is do everything to enhance the joy with which we are able to function as human beings. To the degree that one is able to solve the mystery of what is, one is able to know the future. Isn't that what the scientific method is? Knowing that the same experiment performed under the same conditions will produce the same result in the future as has been demonstrated in the past. Human beings are free to choose what is not, with seemingly endless variations. But the result is always frustration, because their choices will not produce favorable results that can be depended upon to repeat themselves in the future. Those who would equate vengeance with justice feel cheated by the human being who is out of touch with what is. So out of touch that one is able to function with an apparent lack of conscience that seems to exempt one from suffering from one's repeated exercise of choices that are contrary to what is. This encourages the searchers after authority to press their vengeance approach to justice. But though a person's apparent lack of conscience appears to exempt one from suffering the consequences of erroneous choices, as with any natural law, the consequences are nevertheless inherent. If nothing else, the results are never as they would anticipate, and that in itself is demoralizing. However, in a world of searchers after authority, they are constantly getting false feedback that they interpret as indicating their quest may be nearing success. Observe all the fuss society makes with ever-increasing efforts to stop this renegade aspect of society. Government builds more and larger jails to a degree that nearly bankrupts its citizens. The logic on the street is that the jail inmates must be a significant threat to society for such large amounts of money to be spent to hold them in check. They further reason that these jail inmates must be getting close to succeeding, or society would not be so concerned to keep them in bondage. Contrary to the searcher after authority's argument, this tends to encourage the offenders instead of discouraging them. On the other hand, the searcher after what is focused on the quest to identify what is and devotes little attention or anxiety to those who are exploring what is not. That very attitude of indifference tends to give the malefactor a clue that their present endeavor is unproductive, and that perhaps it would be better to pursue other avenues of discovery. This still leaves two groups in society that are affected by the vengeance system of justice that culminates in incarceration. There are those individuals who suffer more or less silently from these same addictions, but who do not act out against society. they are able to persevere and continue to fight to overcome their addictions. The stigma of societal condemnation of this individual's personal battle tends to deflect one's attention from focusing on the internal reasoning that offers clues to one's eventual victory over one's addictions. This threat of outward exposure mistakenly focuses attention outward, diminishing the inward focus whereby a solution might be achieved. The final group comprises those who are not afflicted by this addiction and who in their lifetime never have been and never will be afflicted by this addiction. Though these human beings are not infected with this certain affliction, they nevertheless are human beings. Consciology recognizes that all are imperfect, incomplete, and limited, and that the purpose of life is to expand one's awareness of consciousness. If one is free of certain addictive behaviors, it is likely one is not free of other addictive behaviors. Addictive behaviors arise from inadequate or uniquely perverse sets of conditions that lead one to a misinterpretation of reality. No one is entirely free of these mistaken interpretations of reality. Some will question that they themselves have any connection with addictive behaviors. It is true that reference to addictive behaviors as used here is much broader than normal usage. Classical addictive behaviors are confined to substance abuse, addictions to drugs, including the drug of alcohol. As the study of addictions progressed, it became apparent that the substance could also include an excessive attraction to gambling or an excessive attraction to sex. Classical addictive behaviors are confined to substance abuse, addiction to drugs, including the drug of alcohol. As the study of addictions progressed, it became apparent that the substance could also include an excessive attraction to gambling or an excessive attraction to sex. As more and more excessive attraction behaviors were tested against the model for the treatment of substance abuse, it became apparent that there were few differences. What is, as regards substance abuse, applies as well to any behavior that exerts an excessive attraction on the individual. Actually, the whole concept is backward. Substances do not attract human beings. Human beings attract substances. Substances have no powers to attract. It is the human being who is doing the attracting. The addictive gambler is not drawn to gambling. The human being draws gambling to oneself. The distinction might appear trivial, but it is fundamental. It is not the destructive drug casting a spell over its hapless victim. Any individual with excessive needs in a particular area risks becoming addicted or stuck in that particular area until those needs are met. Overcoming the addiction involves satiating those needs in a precise manner. Satiating excessive needs simply by delivering oneself over to the sought-after substance in whatever form never succeeds. The key word is excessive. If this were merely a need for the sought-after substance, the capture of the substance would satisfy the need, and one would move on to other objectives. But this is an excessive need. By definition, no amount of the sought-after substance will satisfy this excessive need. The solution rests with gaining an understanding of the difference between the searcher after authority and the searcher after what is. If one is able to focus within oneself instead of outward, the view changes from attempting to satiate the insatiable to discovering what it is about oneself that has resulted in this excessive craving. Only by the utilization of reason will the solution be discovered that will deliver one from the bondage of addictive behaviors. When the reasons for the excessive need are discovered, then substitutes can be found that will hold the addictive behavior in check without including the excessive control over the individual that the addicting factor possesses. The substitute addiction is amenable to being satisfied. Reason can transmute that satisfaction of the substitute addiction into gratification of the real addiction, thereby holding it in check. Addictive behavior includes any behavior that the individual draws to oneself with the inordinate passion of an obsession. Obsession, according to the dictionary, is domination of the mind by one idea. But like Jesus' concept of love, this interpretation of obsession is too broad to have much practical value. Obsession is actually dominion of a particular area of the mind by one idea. It is quite possible to have multiple obsessions in different areas of behavior, and at the same time to be entirely free of obsessions in still other areas of behavior. How else could schizophrenic behavior be so difficult to identify? Addictive behavior, as used here, includes any behavior that one becomes stuck on, that seems to prevent one from making further progress in expanding one's awareness of consciousness. By this definition, all human beings are subject in varying degrees to a variety of addictive behaviors. Gaining understanding of these addictive behaviors is what it's all about. Whether the addiction involves heroin, ice cream, or sarcasm. If addictive behaviors infect us all are in need of education in the ways of applying reason to subduing these stumbling blocks in one's path to expanding one's awareness of consciousness. One could say that those individuals not affected by the major addictions are not affected by a society bent on vengeance as justice, but would that be valid? John Donne's poem renounces any justification for such a detached position. No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never sin to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. Justice is not achieved when a portion of society is deprived of its freedom. Justice, in all of its disguises, vengeance, in all of its disguises, inhibits justice. It is a negative factor that detracts from a genuine search after what is. In the name of justice, all manner of despicable acts are performed. Human beings seek to invent a human system of justice out of ignorance, because justice already abounds and is everywhere evident. Evident to those who seek what is. In the beginning, consciousness. Consciousness is awareness of what is. To the extent that one recognizes what is, one discovers how events intertwine in such a way as to culminate in justice to all who have achieved this degree of awareness. To those who do not choose to develop their awareness to this degree, they are free to delay such a choice. The suffering they attract to themselves by their erroneous choices need not be increased by any form of vengeance that we might hope to send their way in the form of human justice. Our welfare and theirs is better served by trying to further our own understanding. By doing so, one provides the example for those who have become distracted by the vain efforts of human beings to achieve some sort of human justice. The fiction of human justice is appealing. It pretends to be achievable without need of the extreme individual effort that is required to recognize the justice that is everywhere abundant.